As an African-American woman and filmmaker, I've seen and documented my share of political protests. Depending on the issues, you could pretty much predict what the makeup of the crowd would be. So I was struck by the protests of 2020, when so many people reacted to the killing of George Floyd. It wasn't the longevity of the protests or even the nature of them. It was witnessing the increasing numbers of white people marching and protesting in support of Black Lives Matter. They were in the streets of our largest cities and our smallest towns. I asked myself, why? There had been police shootings before, but why the numbers now? Were white people finally beginning to understand the injustices that Black people have had to endure for more than 400 years? Was it because the pandemic left people unemployed and therefore able to spend the day protesting? Was it a trend or simply a fad? In my search for answers, I found there were white people and white organizations that were actually talking to other white people about racism, white supremacy, and white privilege, and that organizing is growing. There are groups like Showing Up for Racial Justice, White People for Black Lives, and even Rednecks for Black Lives. This film is just a sample of what I found.
Black people do not need our rescue. They need us to stand side by side and challenge power, challenge institutions that are continuing the racism and equity and oppression since the founding of this country.
White supremacy it's a very charged term. I was raised to see that term as meaning people wearing white hoods. And of course, it includes people who would wear white hoods. It's also a highly descriptive sociological term to describe the society we live in, society that elevates white people as the norm.
I love my white people, and I do not want white supremacy to turn my white people into weapons against people of color.
My parents were pretty racist. They were pretty prejudiced. They were trying to be as American as they could. And I don't know if it's because they were working class, they also didn't think they had the luxury of sharing any negative aspect of their body or their history, for fear that they wouldn't make it in this new world. They didn't want to be thought of as anything less than absolutely 100% white US citizens.
It's better in this country to look like me than it is to look like, Ta-Nehisi Coates. I wasn't taught that I'm better than anybody else overtly, but I think beneath the surface, that's exactly what we're taught.
It's short of wearing a white hood. I think most white people would not see themselves or somebody else as racist, because we're taught that a racist is an individual who consciously doesn't like people based on race and is intentionally mean to them. Individual conscious malintent across race. And that virtually exempts all white people from the system we live in. I'm really clear that I have perpetrated racism in my life, and that I still do on occasion. And I can assure you that not one incident of that was ever conscious or intentional. It still wounded other people. It still came out of my racist conditioning. It still had a racist impact.
People of color didn't invent racism. White people did. And so it was never about going off by ourselves and just doing our thing. It was always about an accountability with people of color-led movements. It was also those stepping in or showing up in our responsibility to be part of dismantling racism. Because white people are the folks who made it up.
Well, let's go back a little bit to SNCC. SNCC told us to go into the white community. And we were like, I don't think so. But I mean, we were imagining going into the white community of the South. Like I had an experience where I went to bail somebody out of the Greenwood jail during the summer of '64. I brought the money. He was a black SNCC worker. I posted the bail. And then I go out of the building and there are 5 steps and there's a man holding a baby, white man holding a baby, and he pushes me down the steps. So the anger of the white Southerners, and then other white SNCC folks had tried to dip their toe into some of those white communities, and they were completely rejected and run out of town. And so working in the white community was not something that we could embrace.
If the only folks organizing to create space for white people to talk about race are the Klan, then that's who organizes white people on race. And so white anti-racists, we need to start getting really skilled at building spaces, organizations, discussion groups, cultural events, political protests that bring white people into racial justice, as opposed to the Klan organizing white people into white supremacy.
I think for me, it didn't really come together until I was out of college. And I had been involved in the campaigns against David Duke when he was running for Senate and governor. And, you know, I watched 670,000 white people vote for a man that we all knew was not just a white supremacist and an ex-Klansman, but a Nazi in every sense of the word. And I remember sitting with that and trying to figure out what that meant and beginning to realize that in that particular moment, right, Black folks had really saved white Louisianans from having a Nazi for governor or for US senator. So you start to sit there and think about whose responsibility is it really to save white people from ourselves?
For me, very early on, it was this idea of choosing sides, and I came to understand that as a white person, I needed to be speaking out and taking action, because otherwise I was playing into the silence of the majority of white people that I knew and that I saw who were not saying anything.
I think one of the most dangerous versions of white supremacy that I see around me today is, I guess I would say, white inaction or white freezing. Just being like, I feel so bad and I don't know what to do, and there are so many ways that I could maybe try and help, but they all are different and I don't know what's the best one, and I don't want to do the wrong one because then people will be mad at me, and so I'm just not going to do anything. I'm just not going to do anything because I don't see myself in this struggle, because I'm too scared of making a mistake, because I don't want to actually risk the comforts that I have in my life. And we have to move past that. We have to be willing to make mistakes. We have to be willing to risk the comforts that we have in our lives.
I don't care how great a white person I might think I am in my heart or even in my mind. If I am not putting my body out there in the work, if I am not willing to talk to other white people to get my neighbors to come down to the rally with me, then I am not chipping away at the silence, which becomes the justification by our leaders in this country for business as usual.
I think the work of Surge and similar organizations that have been explicit about creating spaces for white people to come into the movement, to work out our stuff, and we got a lot of it, but, to create a political home for white people who are realizing this is a problem and want to do something about it, has really helped build a groundswell among white people in white communities.
People who are in the streets, we've got to maintain that pressure, that public pressure of being in the streets and holding. And I know that a lot of organizations and people are trying to intersect that new energy with trainings, with nonviolent direct action training. I live in a basketball state and am a former basketball coach. So I think of it as a full court press. We just have so many lanes to fill and so many pressure points to put on the ball. And so we don't need everybody doing the same thing. We do need people and organizations filling these different lanes.
So that awareness that young white folks now have of like, oh, this is happening still. This is happening right now. This has been happening since you were a kid, and it was happening before you were born, and it's going to keep happening until you do something about it.
And I think that's what Rednecks for Black Lives and the affirmation we've seen and the identity we've seen, with people in the South and the rural South and beyond, is saying, I'm a poor white person. I'm maybe in the South. I'm maybe the last person you think that's going to stand up for Black lives and defend Black lives. And here I am. I'm doing it.
If you organize white people from the place of we have been used We have been duped. White supremacy is a lie that is teaching us to hate people who we actually should be forming deep bonds of beloved community relationship with, who we should be uniting with. And anti-racism is key to economic justice for all, is key to multiracial democracy for all. Anti-racism is key to a healthy society for all of our elders, all of our children, and we want to fight like hell as white people to join with Black-led multiracial movements for racial justice, because it's the right thing to do to end this death culture in communities of color and Black communities. And this is about us as white people refusing to be machines, refusing to be tools, reconnecting to our hearts, reconnecting to our humanity, and rejoining the rest of our people in multiracial beloved community for justice.
There's a certain degree of empathy and sympathy that I could have, and I sort of started to view the work that I do as profoundly pro those people. In other words, not only is it not anti-white people, it's pro those people, trying to actually say to them, no, you have legitimate pains in your life. The problem is that whiteness and white supremacy are keeping you from seeing what the source of that is. And a lot of that pain is white supremacy. A lot of those white folks in Louisiana were in pain precisely because whiteness told them their lives were always going to be good. Whiteness told them if they just worked hard, doubled down, worked 50 hours a week, they would have a better life than their parents, and their kids would have a better life than their parents. And then when the system didn't work out that way for them, right, they had to lash out. And they lashed out at those below them because that's a lot easier than lashing out at those above who lied to them. But I got nothing for love for those people, nothing but love for those people, in the sense of really wanting them not to suffer anymore. But the difference is, I'm not going to indulge their bullshit about why they're suffering.
And, you know, the chicken for us has finally come home to roost. You know, people who are Black, Indigenous, and other people of color have been feeling this pain and feeling this loss literally for centuries. And now white people are too, and it's making us question on like a cellular level, why? And we can't just keep looking at other people anymore. We can't keep looking at the people that the power elite tell us to blame for our problems anymore, because you know what? It's just like that case just doesn't hold enough water right now. There's too much pain going around, and you know, the explanations that they're giving us are just not good enough. And I think people are finally, you know, the veil has been lifted and they're finally seeing it for what it is.
I believe that it is really important for us to engage white people in this moment, to understand that this is not just about today, but this is for the long haul. If we go home and back to the silence that represents the majority of people in this country, then we are not going to be able to be part of the change that's needed.
It means creating new pathways for folks to understand where they come from. You know, like I think that it's an easy and slippery slope sometimes to be like a white, cisgendered, heterosexual man, Christian, Protestant from the South, and be like, well, I'm screwed because I have nothing, I have nothing to stand on in terms of like positive tradition. I have nothing to do. And that's not true. I mean, there's plenty of people that we can look at as our ancestors who fought the good fight as white people, you know, as white men, as white cis het men. There need to be more. I mean, it would be great if there were more. And so now's the time to build that generation of more. And I think that that's the work, is building that generation of more folks who are willing to throw down for freedom movements.
I think what's important for white people to know is that, like, we have a firmly rooted legacy of white folks, you know, fighting against the white supremacist system. And so we have role models that are white, we have role models that are Black, Indigenous, or other people of color. And we don't have to look that far to get to it. So, you know, there are folks like Anne Braden, there are folks like Viola Liuso, who was, you know, a white woman who was killed during the civil rights movement. We have the Grimsky sisters, as, you know, so there are so many people. We have John Brown, who many say, you know, his actions, however debatable it was in the historical context, were precursors to the Civil War. So, like, you know, we have models of ways that we can look at how anti-racist action can look on a variety of different levels. And they also exist today. And we follow the leadership of and the wisdom of those who are most impacted by this white supremacist system. So even, you know, current leaders from Patrisse Cullors to Melina Abdullah to, you know, Yvette Ale to, you know, there's so many people that we can look at locally and nationally as folks that are really our thought leaders and supporters to get us to liberation.
The organizing mentality for anti-racist work in white communities had also been evolving. Because in the 90s and the early 2000s, the emphasis was more on white people. You need to know that racism exists. You need to know that you're racist. You need to know that you have privilege. You need to know that your people have caused mass suffering in communities of color. You should feel ashamed of who you are and now go out and do something about it. But if you are completely immersed in guilt and shame, and you think that you and other white people are the problem, it's hard to move into a place of how am I going to proactively work to make positive change.
I don't particularly mind if somebody comes to the table because they're feeling guilty, but get over yourself. We've got work to do. And the concept of white privilege, I give pushback on this like anyone else does, that this idea that I have privileges because of my white skin, that instantly throws a lot of white people into feeling guilty. Just like the word reparations scares the crap out of a lot of white people. It's like, wait, you're gonna take all my money and give it to, you know, black people? And I'm gonna have to give up my house and my, you know, whatever. And it's like, give me those conversations. I think that these are the really important ones. And the idea of white privilege isn't something that, you know, what it is that I have a set of advantages that are built in because I have lighter skin than my darker skinned colleagues and friends. And that's the reality of racism.
The only other thing I just want to say about like how I, what allows me not to hate myself around racism and the racism that lives inside of me. I think it's just that like I have found my home in movements for racial and economic justice, and those movements saved me. Like I get so much repaired from my childhood and everything that was wrong, so much repaired from the systems that I've suffered under, like as a child and adult. And I think that that is part of what allows me to move on and continue moving, is because there is so much beauty and joy and power and purpose in doing this kind of work. And it's transformed me. And I'm just trying to create spaces for other white folks, in particular for those of us who are coming from deeply broken families and communities, to be able to experience how beautiful that is, to be on fire for it, and to continue doing that fight.
I hope that the lesson will stick, and that we'll be, but it seems to me that those of us who do this work must take advantage of this window opening right now to get that attention and to say, do not forget how vulnerable you're feeling right now. And please know the reason you're feeling that way is because a long time ago, we created a hierarchy of human value in this culture. And we created it so that people like you would always be on top and you'd always be okay. But every now and then, once you've created that mentality, you don't get to contain it in that little space that says white folks will be fine, black folks will be the ones to die. Because at some point, once you've created that notion of a hierarchy, they'll come for you when you're sick. They'll come for you when you're old. They'll come for you when you are immunosuppressed or frail. And they don't care whether you live or die either.
I think that one of the top questions I get from Black people is, why should white people care? I can only imagine looking out at where we are, what we have, what we hold, and you would wonder that. But there is, of course, an incredible cost to maintaining inequality. We are highly manipulable. We can be made to vote against our best interests. There are many things that would serve us so well, like universal health care and good access to public education, and on and on. This would serve everybody. But because we have this kind of scarcity mentality in this sense of we deserve this, you don't, we are set up to have such a profoundly unequal society. And more wealth is concentrated in fewer hands today than ever in recorded history. That also hurts white people. But we get distracted by turning over here and saying, oh, it's the immigrants, or it's affirmative action, or these type of things. So it absolutely serves us. But for me, just in a values level, I deeply believe in justice, and I need to align what I say I believe with the actual practice of my life. If I'm not seeking that in an active way, then that is actually a disingenuous claim.
One of the tricks, the insidious tricks of white supremacy, in my opinion, is that white people don't have to believe that they're bound by their people. They could be just who, they could just be. They could just be this individual thing that exists and controls everything. I think recognizing who your people are is becoming human again, is a part of being a divinely created human thing, a human being. And I think that is part of it too. It's like there's a value in working with our folks to rehumanize ourselves, and to, again, not get all wallowed up in the guilt of the past, but be really committed to the work of the present and the future around responsibility for doing this stuff, because it literally our families' lives are at stake.
And a really clear understanding that I think becomes more and more clear, especially, during COVID, and we've seen just massive evictions, and we'll see more job loss, lack of health care, and just really the impact of that. And also the uprisings, that it's become really clear. And I think it's becoming clearer to poor white people to see our stake in this, to know that when we are in defense of Black lives and Black people have safety and self-determination and the things they need to live and thrive and have joy and safety, then we will have those things too.
And I don't blame any person of color who's maybe sitting back in the moment and saying, is this going to last? How long is this going to last? Is this going to be real? I don't blame any skepticism that might be out there. And I'm also hearing from people of color about hope in this moment and belief in this moment. And it's not going to happen, though, out of these first 60 days. We've got to stay the course in terms of on those multiple points of pressure and keeping this going, and just refusing to live in that kind of society anymore.
That is, I think, really core to where we go from here. Is we try and make sure that all of the non-Black people who are showing up for this moment are not just coming here to show up for a few protests, take a few photos, go home and say, did I check my boxes? Did I go to a protest? Did I pay my debt? Yes, I did. Okay, that's great. Now I go back to my life and I live my life the way I was already living it. We need people to internalize and begin to embody the struggle against white supremacy in every part of their lives, in their relationships, in their families, in their practices in business, and in the ways that they sustain themselves, all of it. And I think that we can only really do that if we help people connect themselves, see themselves as part of the picture, see themselves as part of what this struggle for liberation is about.
The wealth of this country was built on the backs of Black slaves, the land taken from Mexico, land stolen from indigenous people, and those who have ruled this country have benefited incredibly from that. I believe that the white people who will actually play the largest role in dismantling racism and white supremacy will be those white people who are also oppressed by an economic system that benefits the few at the expense of the many. And so to me, our focus should be on who are the other white people that are hurting. Let's get them, let's have them join people of color who have been hurting and who have a vision of the way forward. And together, we can rattle this system and we can change it.
Because of these and other efforts, the conversations that white people are beginning to have amongst themselves just might make their interaction with Black people a little less awkward and more authentic. only then can we all come together to fight this battle and move from protests and marches to the hard but critical task of dismantling systemic and institutional racism for good.
Good evening, everyone. I am Josie Gonsalves. I'll be moderating this evening's discussion on Whites on the Front Line, a short documentary produced by Dean Radcliffe Lines that gives voice to white anti-racists whose charge is to talk to other white people about racism, white supremacy, and white privilege, and to harness the increasing interests of white people in support of Black Lives Matter into action. I'll begin with a brief introduction of our panelists. We have Crass, social justice advocate, author of Towards the Other America, Anti-Racist Resources for White People Taking Action for Black Lives Matter, and Towards Collective Liberation, Anti-Racist Organizing, Feminist Praxis, and Movement Building Strategy. Robin D.G. Kelley, historian and academic, distinguished professor, and Gary B. Nash Endowed Chair in U.S. History, UCLA, author of Freedom Dreams, the Black Radical Imagination, and Race Rebels, Culture, Politics, and the Black Working Class. CARLA Wallace, civil rights activist in Louisville, Kentucky, co-founder of the Fairness Campaign and Showing Up for Racial Justice, and a member of the Kentucky Commission on Human Rights Hall of Fame. Shameka Parrish-Wright, who serves on the board of the Anne Braden Institute for Social Justice Research Community Council and the Sowers of Justice Network, among others. Shameka is an operations manager at the BAIL Project. Welcome, everyone. Let me begin with that celebrated griot, Gil Scott-Heron. In his piece, B-Movie, there's a line. He says, "This country wants nostalgia. Lucky for us, we have a noted historian on the panel to place our discussion in proper historical analysis." First, any brief reflections on the documentary? Anyone wants to share anything?
Well, I mean, I guess I'll go first. And there's a lot of historical reflections to make, which we'll make in the course of our conversation. First, I just want to say it's such an honor to be here with all these people who I've admired, followed, studied, learned from. And so I just feel like a great fly in the wall to watch this conversation. The film, I think, is very, very important for a couple of reasons. One, there was already a presumption that was something different about the spring of 2020, that, you know, you see a lot of white people on the streets. And one of the things that I think the film does is that it explains not only why and the urgency, but it gives a kind of longer view. In other words, it's not as if white people suddenly woke up after the death of George Floyd. There's all this organizing that's been going on. And that's something I think we really need to talk about. And there is also a distinction in who the white people are who talk about this. There's some who harp on like how to change our attitude toward each other and leave it there. And there's those who, I won't even name names, but some of us are here, who say you got to put your body in the street.
Yes.
And for a different reason, because the idea is not to make white people better, but to transform the country. And so there's a long history of struggle where the stakes are not just how to like relieve ourselves of white privilege, but how to transform a country that's actually exploiting people and convincing people that white privilege is real for all those poor white people, let alone everyone else who's being exploited by a system. And that system's hardly ever named. And so you could tell in the film, which is so wonderful, there are those who are naming the system and those who see a system without the larger system. And that, to me, is a fundamental question that we have to address.
Anybody else? CARLA, Chris, Shameka? Guys are good. Thank you, Robin. I think you've laid out a sort of a framework for us that comes right out of, sort of like the charge that sort of Gil Scott Heron sort of demands that we think about, right? We've got some real history, real things that happen. We've got to place them, what we're doing now in that context. So my first question, which of course is to everyone to answer from your vantage point. The documentary brought up a critical component of this work, language. Several of the interviewees used words, terms like comfort, privilege, and guilt to describe core messages in their work. Now, on the other hand, Black Lives Matter activists raised demand for protections and racial justice. Of course, all this rests in a racialized construct where whiteness is power, not skin color, shapes our social, economic, and political paradigms. This raises the question, can white anti-racists wrestle, interrogate, deconstruct whiteness as power, not color, with white people? Who wants to start us off? Chris, CARLA?
I'll start us off because I know that they're going to go deeper than me. I just want to stay with the surface of this, thinking about a recent interview with former LMPD officer Madden Lee. And I just happened to catch, I didn't see the interview. I heard about it, but I saw a news headline that said that she wasn't killed, Breonna Taylor wasn't killed because of her race, denying that racism had any part in this. And the fact that, I'm disgusted that he was even given a platform to even be interviewed in this way. What's interesting to me is that even he, who is guilty of helping to kill Breonna Taylor, recognizes that it is not good to be a racist, right? In his own sick way, even though he's participating in it, he wanted to outright say she wasn't killed because of race. And that is something to me that is powerful, because even though he's probably middle class, I think that where poor white people join our fight is the most important, right? Because at the end of the day, they had their white skin and that afforded them privilege, and it still does. And so when we have more poor white people joining this struggle, it's not just the scholars, and it's people who live similar everyday lives as Black people in many ways. It's people who have traditionally and continue to vote against their own best interests, i.e. Mitch McConnell has been in office for 36 years and has done nothing for poor white people. And then I think about the statement, I don't watch anything with Trump as well, but I did hear about what he said and something about doing more for Black people, or I think that's crazy. But even thinking about that, you have people who even in their racist actions think that they're still doing something for Black people. I remember my dear mentor, Ann Braden, would say, she would get frustrated when people say, you do so much for Black people. And she said, I didn't do it for Black people, Shameka. I did it because I saw something wrong with my people. That's the reason why I'm out in the street, right? I know that my people will die at these protest actions if I don't use every resource that I can to be out there to educate them, to give them my best practices. But I have to let the young people lead the way, but I still want to be out there to help protect them because something's wrong. Racism is wrong, poverty is wrong, and white fear is what got us here. That's the language that I've been using as I interact with our white allies that come to me at Injustice Square Park. I tell them white fear got us here. I had one seasoned white ally come to me and said, I'm sorry we didn't do something about this sooner. And it really made me think about that. And I said, you know what, with all the gains that we had from the civil rights era, all the historical challenges and things we've been able to accomplish, we've never been free of police brutality. We've never been free of police violence. And I think that you said it so well, Mr. Kelley, is that it's a wake up call, but we were aware that people were still dying at the hands of the police. We were aware that poverty is an issue, that racist practices still run rampant in our systems. But I think that what's happening now with the police, who we've been trained to see and give the benefit of the doubt on every account, is that we are all connected. That any of us, with George Floyd, with Breonna Taylor, who was safe at home, who was an essential worker, who was someone who saved lives, if she can die in the middle of the night, then it's going to come to all of our porches if we don't do something about it. And any given time, we have to make sure that these gains are not just for us right now. We have selfish interests, but we also want to see our young people go on and be leaders and be pioneers. And you can't do that with a racist police system in the way that we want to. So yeah, the civil rights, we got a lot of gains, but we've never got what we need. And so it does take white people, especially poor white people, to put their bodies on the line, because they have a fight. They have I don't want to say dog in this fight, but they definitely have a fight to be here with us, and we need them here with us.
Yeah, this is so critical. This piece being named about that this is a long haul, that this struggle has deep roots. And it is not good enough for white folks to do their work on our attitudes and our microaggressions and our fragility and leave systems of power in place. There's a deep intersection, what Shameka named about which white people is critical, because there's a deep intersection between the maintenance of property for the few and violent policing. We cannot shift racism alone as some siloed issue without challenging the context of the way power is distributed, the way economic power is distributed, and a system that throws people away and controls us by keeping us divided, using race to convince those of us who are white, who have everything to win from a vision that has been set out by Black liberation, to keep us from understanding that our interests, our future actually lies in connecting with Black liberation, Brown and Indigenous liberation, to free ourselves and each other. And that is just a critical piece that's being named here. This is not about attitude shifts. I am not interested in attitude shifts. I'm interested in joining together to change the system for all of us.
Excellent.
And just building off of what folks have been sharing here, you know, for me, thinking about, you know, so I came into it mostly working class family, mostly working class friends, mostly working class communities, and seeing the ways that the only white people who regularly talked about race were racist. And so it was white people who talk about race are the racists. And then if you're trying to be a good white person, you know, like the attitudes piece, you don't talk about race. You just say, well, I'm not a racist, I'm colorblind, or, you know, people can be whatever color they want, and I see them as being fully human, treat everyone with respect, but then abandon the struggle for racial justice, for liberation, for systemic change. So more of this personal behavior, personal attitude, but then seeing how racist white people were organizing to win the battle of ideas and to organize white people into, whether it was the racism of the Republican Party or the racism of vigilante, neo-Nazi, and Klan groups. And so for me, studying and being deeply inspired by Black liberation movement, and then hearing the calls from organizers of color of, you need to organize white people. And so that was deeply scary for me to think about, okay, what does that mean to try to organize in white communities? And what it pushed me into was recognizing the ways that white supremacy is a devastating force in the lives of white people, in the lives of my family, in the life of my friends, in the ways that white supremacy malnourishes the intellectual culture, malnourishes the soul, malnourishes white communities. And then as a solve to that malnourishment, to the pain of economic inequality, giving white people the false sense of superiority of racism. And these are the people to blame. these are the people to feel better than, these are your targets, and then to embolden working class people in my community and my family to feel I'm better than, and then to feel good about themselves. So that sense of self-worth for white people is deeply connected to anti-Black racism. Of your sense of self-worth comes from either being better than or actively hating Black people and people of color. And so for me, seeing the ways that white supremacy was a death culture in white communities too, and that it's not, again, about this attitude change of individual whites, but a structural systemic effort to build liberatory, racial justice, powerful, nourishing culture in white communities that helps heal the pain and the spiritual malnourishment in white communities that white supremacy creates, so that white people can then join in multiracial movements to end the economic inequality, to end the structural nightmare of supremacy systems. So to build up white people's resilience and courage and sense of self connected to liberation values, as opposed to the lie and the death culture of white supremacy.
Robin?
Yeah, well, this is actually great. And in fact, it does a couple of things. It opens a space for a kind of thumbnail sketch of what does this history look like.
Yes.
And just building on what everyone said, actually. Keep in mind that there's a long history of white anti-racist organizing, but oftentimes the white wasn't organizing around white as a racial group responsible for Black and brown suffering. They organized themselves as a class. Mm-hmm. And they all organized themselves as a class against a system which they named. They named it capitalism. Mm-hmm. We could call it racial capitalism. A system that extracted wealth or surplus through racist policies and practices and ideologies, but also extracted wealth and surplus from working class white people, convincing them that somehow they are the beneficiaries. They may be benefiting in certain ways, but not others. But when we look at this longer history, I think we need to change the narrative. Like, for example, when we talk about Denmark Vesey, the slave conspiracy, 1822, 130 African Americans were arrested as part of that conspiracy. So were 4 white men. In 1815, George Boxley from Spotsylvania, Virginia, organized a slave insurrection in the state, tried to, it failed, white dude. When, we have a whole long history. Anne Braden's name was mentioned. Anne and Carl Braden, as everyone on this panel knows, and certainly many people who've seen the film know, have sacrificed much of their lives and put their bodies on the line and their resources to fight racism. I got to know Anne, before she passed. And one of the things that's important about all of them is they came out of a class struggle. They came out of movements, left movements that said there's something wrong with the system that extracts wealth for a few and exploits the many. Then you have, just very briefly, Fred Hampton, of the Black Panther Party. December 4th is the anniversary of his assassination, was organizing with white working class young people, Rise Up Angry, Young Patriots organization. That was the Rainbow Coalition, building power. The John Brown Anti-Klan Committee. You have white people who went to prison, Laura Whitehorn, Marilyn Buck, Linda Evans, Susan Rosenberg, who, basically fighting the Klan. And one of the things I worry about is that when we focus too much on trying to change attitude, we miss 2 things. One, the fact that we actually have white terrorist organizations that have persisted with tacit and direct state support that are killing people. Alicia Garza's name is on a list of people who are on a hit list, right? So this is serious work. 5 members of the Communist Workers' Party died in 1979 fighting the Klan and organizing laborers. 3 of those were white, right? So this is a very serious history. Then you have state violence, police violence. And I'm so glad Shameka made the points that she made, because, there's the fact that there's still a debate about whether or not police violence is part of structural racism or bad apples, that we're even having that conversation. I mean, this is exactly the kind of interventions that we need. An implicit bias training is not going to, somehow relieve us of state violence. We've got to be able to dismantle this whole system and see the relationship between our poverty and inequality and the police and the Klan, not as separate entities. And that requires a fight that is, so the fights that are going on now, the best ones are in that tradition I just laid out.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much. I think we're getting to really the crux of this, right? The intersection of white supremacy and capitalism, and the way in which the forces that the state uses to protect property. And when we talk about, what Black Lives Matter activists are saying on the street is, where are those protections? It brings me to the next question, which is, recently, the Trump administration released an Office of Management budget denouncing the use of federal monies and trainings in critical race theory, white privilege, anti-racism, or any other training or propaganda effort that teaches us or suggests either that the United States is an inherently racist or evil country, or that any race or ethnicity is inherently racist or evil. It appears to assert that federal employees have been subjected to trainings in which they are required to acknowledge that virtually all whites are racist and that they've benefited from racism in contravention of basic American values. Trump's Department of Education intends to review training materials and even employee book clubs to eliminate this allegedly un-American propaganda. The question, setting aside a partisan political state of affairs in which the country finds itself, how is this memo finding its way into your work and your spaces? How is it being addressed or analyzed? And how are you moving through it or past it?
All right, let me jump in again. First of all, a country that was formed from people running from political, religious oppression and repression, it's a travesty to even have those statements made by our president. I think that's an example of why it matters for us, the people that are on the ground, the people who are in these conversations right now, to do our work even more. We cannot expect the right leadership to come from that direction. But to say it's woven into everything that I do and everything that I see being done since I began doing social justice work and trainings. I've done trainings with CARLA WALLACE, we've done bystander trainings, we've done trainings for the Human Relations Commission, and I was once a commissioner as well. The trainings and the education has to keep going. We are a young country. We made a lot of mistakes. It's like, how many versions of the iPhone did it take to really get it to do what it needed to do? So there's part of our work is going to be ongoing no matter what we do. What I do want to address is that, and especially as we going into holiday season, is we can't buy our way out of this. We can't buy our way out of it. And I even have to say that to my own people, to my Black people. I don't care how much money you get, you're not going to buy your way out of this. And so we have to accept that's what it is. But we can use money to support the people closest to the problem so they can be leaders in the solutions. We can definitely use money to do that. And then after that, as we continue to go on and we attack poverty and on every level, which is what I like to think about the work that I'm doing, is this attacking poverty. Because I think racism and that arc that Ann and so many amazing folks talked about Martin Luther King, that arc towards justice is so long right now. And in our lifetimes, what's tangible for me is that we can today do something about poverty. We can do something about changing the policies and the laws. But it doesn't stop there. I want to share with you from a white ally. In the middle of the night, I was checking on her, and my team, I work for the Bell Project as an operations manager, using my resources there. I'm co-chair of the Kentucky Alliance Against Racist and Political Repression, which was started by Ann Brady, Angela Davis, and others. But we have death threats. We've gotten letters, snail mail, letters and emails and calls because of the work that we've been doing and supporting the protesters. And so we're supposed to be shot in our head on November the 3rd. So Robin, Kelley, you're exactly right about how this, it's not just online. When you start getting snail mail, it's a real deal. So when I finish this panel, I literally have to get on the call with security experts to make sure all 6 of the people on my team here and the person that's in Cincinnati are protected. because we have to treat all threats as valid until we can disprove them. So one of the people who I'm worried about the most sent me this. It says the revolution isn't the end goal. It's about all the people who are changed in the process of getting there. It's about building ethics together instead of just changing the rules. And I totally agree with that. I did let her know that, yeah, we definitely get there together. The revolution is still important to many because people in this day of time of instant gratification, they need to see something tangible. They need to see, oh, I can push this button and this is going to work. And so we have that piece that is working, but we constantly have to be working on these other aspects that you speak of. And then when we have leadership on a federal level, which a lot of the federal policies don't necessarily touch us in our state unless we're in that situation, but it's important for no one should ever be against training. No one. I mean, I remember even Ann would say to me, I'll always see the world through my white eyes, no matter what I do. So I think that that's evident that that's the same as me. I started out poor. I came into activism, but I was a poor woman on the streets, a poor young girl on the streets with a father in and out of prison. That's who I am. If you break down every core of every title, I'm that person first. And so I think when Ann said that to me, I knew what she meant. I knew that she meant like, I still need work. It doesn't mean that I'm perfect. It doesn't mean that I make mistakes, but it's a constant struggle. And so that's why we even use that. Freedom is a constant struggle, but we also have to be open to training, education, and learning on every level. And anybody in leadership that is not for that is not, they're not worthy of that role.
Does anyone else want to weigh in on that?
I mean, I think that with the Trump administration talking about the training war, I mean, that's just a long line. There's always been a history of efforts to suppress liberatory education, efforts to be able to bring people together across differences, to be able to then talk about unity and be able to talk about building a different world. So that's it's just like a recent example of a long line of people with ruling class power or with a right-wing racist agenda trying to prevent. So I mean, some of the first organizing I was doing with white people was trying to help build up popular support amongst working class white students at the community college I went to expand ethnic studies, to hire more faculty of color, to expand women's studies. And one of the things that organizers of color would say is they'd say, okay, well, you and like a bunch of your white friends, like take all these classes, you're really committed to this, to what we're doing here, to this multiracial coalition. But what we need is to organize hundreds of white people to support this and understand, and get behind it. And you got to figure out what that means. And so part of that meant starting to openly identify as a white person, this is why studying Black history is so important for me. Part of the ways that white supremacy malnourishes white people's hearts and souls and minds is by saying that all of that history is not yours. There either is no history from people of color, or if there is, it has nothing to do with you. Maybe you can learn a couple sentences about who Dr. King was, but then you're done. And so for me, it was really trying to articulate a message to white people of taking ethnic studies classes for men, learning women's history is powerful for liberating ourselves, is critical consciousness to be able to get free. And so again, not take an ethnic studies class to learn more about people of color and be more sensitive, but learn about the Black liberation struggle, learn about multiracial movements for justice, because these are pathways of vision, strategy, leadership, culture to help us all get free now. And so really articulating why this work was crucial, because too often anti-racist work with white people is like, the world sucks, you're white, and so you're part of the problem, so you suck too. And now work with us to try to make things not suck so much. And so for me, the message was, no, the world does have major systemic problems and injustices, but there's such a better world for us. Beloved community, multiracial democracy, economic justice. These are pathways to a better society and world for all of us. And it's not about that as a white person you suck. It's as a white person you've been turned into a machine by capitalism and a tool by white supremacy, and we want to get free. So organizing white people from a deep love of white supremacy, you cannot keep having my people. You cannot have my family. You cannot have my kids. And we will fight you, and we will join together in Black liberation struggle and multiracial movements to all get free.
Yeah, I also just want to say, I think that, Trump having to talk about, we're going to stop the trainings, et cetera. You have city councils, you have candidates having to debate issues like defunding the police, racial justice training, et cetera. That is also a testament to this moment that has been opened up by Black bodies leading in the streets, lifting up that history of the struggle against police violence. We are in a moment in this country that I've never seen in my 40 years of organizing, in terms of what has been opened up by Black communities fighting. White people, more and more of us are standing with. We need a lot more in showing up for racial justice. We believe in the importance of study connected to action. Organizing has to happen on the ground, people, and sometimes it's the tedious work of knocking door to door in, for instance, white working class communities, where we are partnered with the Bail Project to talk with struggling white folks here in Louisville, Kentucky, about how their families have been impacted by the inequity of cash bail. If you have a credit card, you get out of jail. If you don't have a credit card, if you don't have money, you don't get out. And a lot of white folks are impacted. We don't do that work without talking about racial justice and who's blamed and who's benefiting. It's the folks on top that are benefiting. It's not, people are not hurting because immigrant families are in this country. They're not hurting because Black people are protesting in the streets. That's actually the hope for all of us. And so I think we also, in this moment, there is a space that has been created for more change than we usually go for. And one of the dangers is that we will cut ourselves short from asking for what has to happen, and that there will be moderate tweaks here and there, and that all that energy, the risk that has been taken, will be moderated down to, we're going to have body cams, we're going to have microaggression training for the police. That has failed. And we're calling for more. We're calling for defunding the police, because defunding the police means we'll have funding to address mental illness issues and homelessness issues and juvenile support systems, youth support systems. There's so much that needs to be changed, and one of the dangers is that we will fall short of what we demand. No, we're not going to win everything. We're not going to win everything this time around, but if we don't ask for what we want and need, we will win much less than we may be able to.
Absolutely. I think you've answered the next question, and I guess, Robin, you could sort of weigh in on this question, because I think most people have already addressed it, which is that, is the current white anti-racist work becoming a brand element in the diversity, equity, and inclusion industrial complex? Is it becoming separated from the larger fight for social justice and democracy, separated from the anti-settler colonization struggle?
Right. Well, let me just say one thing and then connect to that, to answer that question, which is that what we're seeing with the Trump administration in this kind of rollback or attack on trainings on critical race theory, on Howard Zinn, it's an old playbook. Mm-hmm. It's an old playbook. I mean, the origins of ethnic studies and Black studies in this country, you could draw a straight line. Yes. That knowledge is a struggle over power. And we got to remember that some of the most important opponents to a radical critique, or at least a truthful accounting of the creation of the Western world, came from liberals, like Arthur Schlesinger Jr. I mean, in other words, it's not just like we vilify, not we, but people vilify Trump as if Trump is the culprit. And once we get rid of him, when Bill Clinton was trying to organize a national conversation on race, John Hope Franklin did his best to try to bring that on, but they weren't going to have it. They're not going to have it. And what they're not going to have is a reckoning with a kind of a real authentic history of how this country was founded. You know, and that's another, I'm getting off the track, but to go back to this question of, you know, I opened up with my initial response to the film by acknowledging what the film does so well, and that is it shows different alternative ways of thinking about the work. So I can't, it's not a one size fits all. What showing up for racial justice what Surge is doing is very different from the kind of, and what Chris is doing is in with the long history of the, you know, National Alliance Against Racial and Political Repression is doing is very, very different from the corporate diversity model. This is not diversity training. Anti-racist training is not diversity training. Anti-racism is not an identity politic. You know, it is a social, political, cultural critique that's a life and death matter. And I've participated in Surge conversations, and they're the most important, critical, engaging conversations that go completely against the grain of, you know, the nonprofit industrial complex funding for these kinds of events. And that's why many of the people who come out of these movements, all the movements we're talking about now, are people who have suffered from state repression. That's very different from having a New York Times bestseller and then giving lectures at $10,000 a pop. You know, it's not the same thing. So I don't want to put them together. And I think that what I'm seeing, and that's why I really agree with what CARLA said, this is a different moment. We have a long history. What was different about this moment is that it's not white anti-racism per se, but it is the broader participation in a structural critique, in radical critique and abolitionist politics that makes this different. Abolitionist politics is not diversity training. It's not inclusion, diversity, equity. It's something much more radical. And that's what we're seeing. And that's the work we need to support. And I'm all for putting our money too in support of these organizations.
Thank you. Does anyone have any other sort of to add to what Robin just said? And we can go on to our last question, actually.
I could listen to Robin go on, and because I'm seeing it in every day and doing this work. So we talked about earlier in Justice Square, that was intentional. The intentionality is what I see in the white people. I once made a comment and said, I don't know what kind of white people you deal with, but the white people I know and I deal with know that it's important to be intentional in every way. And that's how I saw Ann Braden, Tom Moffitt, I see Carla Wallace and so many others in everything we do. And I'm glad you separated diversity from that, because that is different. And what we've seen at Injustice Square, just to give you that ground view, is a lot of organic organizing. And so my team, because my work intersects, so I get the most time, and it's a blessing. I'm at a point in my life where I could be paid to do my job, but also relocate and have a satellite office right there in Injustice Square. So it was my idea to name it Injustice Square, because we're surrounded by city government, from our mayor's hall to our city council to our jail to our, ironically, Hall of Justice. And our first jail was named after a famous slave catcher, and Louisville was a port city. And so slaves were sold right where we're organizing at Injustice Square. So our ancestors are there as well. And people were like, why here? Why in the middle? It's like we placed ourselves right in front of their castle and they can attack us anytime. And believe me, they have, and they continue to. But it was intentional for them to know that it will never be business as usual again. What we had to do is be consistent enough and intentional enough for people to wake up and understand their power and showing up. No way, and when I grew up poor and on the streets, a good year or good day was not being pulled over by the police, and you don't go to the courthouse. I mean, if you had a year, you didn't have to go to the courthouse, and now we're there every day organizing right in front of the courthouse. So people can't just go to lunch and go do this work and not see us and not be reminded of the justice that's lacking. And also using injustice was intentional as well, because we know what justice looks like. We know what fairness looks like. We know what we want it to look like. But when we think about injustice, it's really making not even just white people, but Black and brown people to understand you have been living in such unjust situations for so long. It's trained you to be this way. It's trained you to give the police the benefit of the doubt and to find a reason to see that Breonna somehow through her connection deserved to die. We have Black people who think because she was connected to whoever. I said, well, if we all were guilty because we knew somebody that ate chicken, then we all would be dead, right? And so you can't, and so we have a relearning process even with our own people. But what you see happening at Injustice Square is a lot of organic organizing, people networking, and then people bringing ideas, and really me just having an ear and say, yeah, that makes sense. Make it make sense and let's do it. So it drives my team crazy because they're like, Shameka, you can't say yes to everything. But I'm loving the energy around people reimagining. And yes, it's both beautiful and ugly at the same time, right? Yes, somebody was shooting dice right by the Hall of Justice. That's something I would never do, but that's what they chose to do. And just think about what that means to have all these young Black and brown and poor white bodies right there on the ground, living their life, reimagining themselves, seeing themselves as the next John Lewis or the next Maxine Waters, seeing themselves as activists, telling me that I want to run for office and I want to make change. And so it's been a lot of blood, sweat, and tears, but that intentionality has been the most important thing, and being as consistent as possible. And then we have to help people get free. And that takes time. So seeing, like you were talking about, Chris, and seeing that our liberation from police abuse and racism is tied together. Nobody had a cookie cutter for that. So I'm so glad that you separated that out, because that isn't diversity. That isn't just inclusion. We're talking about, we need to know that the horse has been riding the man when it comes to the way the police govern our city. Our police run our city. And so I am out to water down that power, water down their endorsements, encourage our elected officials. Yeah, you might not get their endorsement, but you stand with the people. Anytime you stand with the people, you are right. And encouraging them to do that, because it's not about the money, because the money won't get us there, but we need your votes in the right place. So to have the police contract questioned for the first time, even my dear friend Representative Scott, when she was on the Metro Council, she said, I thought about that. I didn't even question it before, because we didn't question that. We always give the police the benefit of the doubt. And then to have a vote on an ordinance that makes sure that use of force is being limited, those are just steps in the right direction to even make them think that. So we have our 26 Metro Council, we have 15 for, we have 10 who didn't. But we know that those 10 that didn't they're not worried about us as a people. They're only worried about the power of the police endorsement. And because it's an election. And so we have to get in there early, be intentional, so that election day doesn't determine the level of justice that we get.
So I think that what we've seen here is the intersection of white supremacy and capitalism, and addressing the material conditions of people across race, across gender, and building that coalition. So I really appreciate the discussion. It brings us to a final question. Over the past 2 weeks, many say that in the US, citizens can become narrowly focused on US conditions and fail to see such as part of a larger global liberation context. With that in mind, whether it's true or not, how are each of you discussing the recent uprising, the youth uprising in Nigeria, and their call to end police violence and economic justice, now political change? How is the call for liberation in Nigeria part of the struggle for liberation in the US?
So at Showing Up for Racial Justice, we believe that an international perspective or a global solidarity is critical, and that we here in the US have everything to learn, especially from the struggles in the global South, up against repressive conditions, horrendous economic conditions, much of which is connected to how the US treats the rest of the world and its history of exploitation, militarization, domination. And so, whether it's the struggle of the Palestinian people in the West Bank, or it's the struggle of, students in Indonesia, or it's Nigeria, South Africa, there is everything to gain from learning from each other and from having international solidarity against global capitalism. I mean, that war, racism, occupation, those are all used to keep people down and to keep us separate. You know, racism is used to drum up those of us here in this country against people who have never done anything to us. And who loses? You know, the poor in this country lose from a militarized economy and a militarized police force, the deep connections between the military and the police, the weapons that are used, the way folks figure out how to chase and capture and kill people, all of that. So I don't believe I don't believe we can move forward without a global perspective and without international solidarity. And I think there's tremendous power if we can grow that.
Anyone else? We still have a few minutes.
Oh. All right, I'll jump in. This reminds me, so I just did a conference with a bunch of amazing people from all over the world and in Italy. And then at the end, towards the end, they had some young people come up and they were talking to us about their struggles. There was a young white woman and a young Black woman, and they were amazing. And it reminded me of every major push for real change, not just here in the US, but all over, started with a lot of young people being bold and brazen and ready to take action. And so I always said, I don't like to use the term old, that seasoned people, those of us who have been there and done that and got the t-shirt, it is our job to support them and to support the work that they're doing. So when I saw, we even had an action for SARS at Injustice Square, right on the steps. And a young person from U of L just emailed me and said, can you support this? And gave me the flyer. And I said, of course. So when we've been talking all along about how our liberation is tied together, we see that many of us lives in police states. I think that's why George Floyd and Breonna Taylor has trended all over the world. Even at Injustice Square, people have come from all over, from France. I just talked to another reporter from somewhere in England, like all over the world. There's been amazing people coming to see what we're doing, to see when Big Brother goes down, everybody wants to see, right? And so I think people are seeing that Big Brother has not done everything right. We all know it. And now Big Brother is under the watch from the world. And so I think that people are pulling up with their chairs to see. But I think most people are wanting to see how they can get involved and how they can connect the issues, exactly like you said. Because what we've seen at Injustice Square and what we see all over the world is that they care more about property than they do our poor Black, brown, and white bodies, right? They care more about property. So the youth know that. The youth know that when they're seen, when they come on the scene, they're already seen as a weapon. And so that has energized them to say, you already see me this way. I cannot tell you how many young people have come to me and said, Shameka, I will die for this cause. I will die to prove this. And I know a lot of seasoned people who won't do that, who won't come down, who might send a case of water or send a check, but they're not going to come and put their bodies on the line and go toe to toe with the police officers. That's what we see our youth doing. And speaking, it's not even like they're coming and they're swinging on them. All acts of violence have started with LMPD or with the police in engaging us in that way. But the youth has said, I don't care. I'm not scared of you. Just think about how empowering it is to look at your abuser and to tell them that you're not scared. And so that unchecked power has went on for too long. And I've been telling people, you get more with love and respect than you do with fear and money. And I think that what we're seeing is that come to true. And for our youth, they move differently. I tell them all the time, they got all these ideas. I'm like, look, let me tell you something. I'm findable. I'm 43. I'm a grandma. I'm with the things, but I can't do all the things. But I can support you and tell you what the best practices are, because my level of engagement is different because of these things. But I can't tell you that if I was 20, I would be I have 3 daughters in their 20s. And I know that, and they were in the streets. So I know that the mindset is there that they don't care about whether they go on to own a house, whether they go on and get promoted from their job. I always tell people, if I worked for a local organization, I would be fired, right? Because I've been using my position with this national organization to push this agenda, and they can't come at me the same way they can somebody else that works for the mayor's office. You know what I mean? So it's my job to do what I can, but our young people are empowered. They're bold, they're beautiful from all over the world. But I will end with this. This is a quote from Martin Luther King that I love, that I kept as my signature for my emails. And it says, if we are to have peace on earth, our loyalties must become innumerable rather than sectional. Our loyalties must transcend our race, our tribe, our class, and our nation. And this means we must develop a world perspective. That's always been my approach to any level of organizing that I do, is that I know now we have the use of social media, and that scares a lot of people, and I get it, but now somebody from Turkey can tell me what their struggle is right now, today. I don't have to wait to get a letter. They can show me a video of what they're going through, and I can instantly identify with that. Social media does come with some issues, but for that part of it, that piece, to use it for connecting the issues, is so powerful that I know it's going to be limited. I know, because it's so ahead of the law right now, they would love to just shut it all down, but they can't right now, but they're working to do that. So while we have it, I take it as a way to use it as a tool, just like voting is a tool, to show how connected we are, and what we've all been saying, and how much our liberation is tied together.
Phenomenal.
That was brilliant. And what Shameka said was there are three pillars that she gave us that we have to go away with. Those three pillars are: all successful, effective movements are international.
Yes.
Young people lead the way.
Yes.
And when Big Brother goes down, that is when you bring down empire. It is also part of the liberation of this planet and our ability to survive. And just really quickly, in those three things, it is so true. The Black Panther Party, Cincinnati in 2001, Ferguson in 2014, these were all movements with young people at the front, but also that were international. As Carl was mentioning, Palestine was one of the central issues on the streets of Ferguson. And we see this, over. And also, Fees Must Fall in South Africa and Roads Must Fall was an inspiration for young people here in the United States. So what's happening in Nigeria now is both an extension of and an inspiration for some of these struggles around the world. Because what we know is that Big Brother is also shaping the forms and structures of state violence around the world, and has been doing it at least for a half a century, and much more than that, at least for 70 years. So, and in Brazil, where there's a long, violent history, even before Bolsonaro was elected, of the police killing Black people, and organizing around that. And Movement for Black Lives, Surge, of course, all these different movements are aware of that. They're in conversation with these movements, And so that internationalism is par for the course. And when we lose it, our movements lose.
And then I'll just jump in here with like thinking about all of what we've been hearing. So for white people who are watching this, for white people who are new to this work, I was doing a workshop the other day, and an 8th grader, white, young, 8th grade boy, he said, I know I don't want to be racist. I know that racism is wrong, but I don't know what to do. And I don't know how to talk to my friends, and I don't know how to talk to my family. And his parents were sitting there right next to him. And I asked him, okay, well, why do you want to talk about racism? And he said, well, because it's wrong, and it does terrible, it's violent and hurts people. And I said, so why do you want to be anti-racist? And he said, well, because I don't want to be part of this. I don't want to be a part of this. And so I said, well, so for new white people, checking in with our hearts and leading with our hearts, you're not going to have to try to figure this all out, all the analysis, understanding all the issues. You're gonna learn that and develop that over time, but bring your heart and your body into social justice movements, showing up for racial justice, joining efforts in your community, getting involved. So don't think that you have to understand everything before you can start actively participating in justice movements. They happen together. And so for new white people, tap into your heart, because white supremacy tries to confuse our brains and then tries to deflate and disempower our hearts. So build up your heart with liberation values. But then also for white people who are anti-racist, there can be such a competitive capitalist thing about who's the best anti-racist. And so we have to move out of this idea of trying to be a really good anti-racist into becoming really effective anti-racist organizers, leaders, culture builders, and bringing more and more white people into this work. So if a white person uses the language of diversity and inclusion, because that's the language that is available to them, don't say, oh, well, that's not what it's all about and you're totally backwards. Invite them into how equity and inclusion are absolutely critical, and capitalism survives on exclusion and destroying diversity as vibrant, full dignity and respect for all. And so use the language that people have, but bring them into deeper racial justice values, not because you want to prove who you are, but because you want to bring more and more people into this work so that we can build the powerful movements we need to build up culture and a new society. So more leadership of how can I listen to white people's hearts? Because the language is confusing. White people were not supposed to be effective anti-racists. White people are supposed to be confused. White people are supposed to be fragile. White people are supposed to just be totally ignorant. As anti-racists, we're not here to just critique white people's failings. We're here to build up white people's potential to get free, to be part of liberation movements, and to nourish white people's hearts and souls. Not just tell white people you're racist, you don't understand. Of course white people are racist and don't understand. That's what white supremacy as a system does. So our job is to build up culture, leadership, organization, opportunity, poetry, culture, to bring white people into this work to be nourished, resilient, and courageous.
Liberation, liberation, liberation. I want to thank you guys so much. This has been amazing. I wish we had more time to spend together, and we will, because we're on the path together, and more will join us on this path, particularly after this film is seen and after folks hear what you've had to say, what you're doing, and where we go next. So I want to thank Dean Ratcliffe-Lyons for inviting me to moderate this discussion. It's been amazing. Whites on the Front Line, see it, let it start a conversation. On behalf of Dean, thank each of you for giving your time today and for your ongoing work in the struggle for liberation. Okay. Liberation, liberation. Cheers.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.